Welcome to New Genesis Novel, where the greatest minds are modernized for today. Hello, I am Margaret Mitchell, the author of Masterpiece. I suppose if we are to talk about how I came to be the woman who wrote that heavy manuscript, we must go back to the very beginning, to the red clay of Atlanta, Georgia, where I was born in November of 1900. You see, I was born into a world that was constantly looking backward, a city that had been burned to the ground just 36 years before my birth but was already rising up again, bustling and modern, yet deeply haunted by its own ghosts. I grew up on Jackson Hill, just east of downtown Atlanta, in a home where history was not something you read in a textbook but something that sat in the parlor and drank sweet tea. My childhood was entirely populated by elderly relatives and family friends who had lived through the Civil War and the Reconstruction era. They were cavalrymen, infantrymen, and the formidable women who had kept the home fires burning, and they told stories with such vivid, terrifying detail that I felt as though I had lived through the blockade and the siege myself. In fact, they spoke of the war so incessantly and with such fierce pride that I was 10 years old before I finally learned that the South had actually lost. My father, Eugene Muse Mitchell, was a prominent attorney and a founder of the Atlanta Historical Society, which meant our house was always filled with dusty volumes, legal briefs, and endless debates about local history. My older brother Stevens and I would listen for hours on Sunday afternoons as the older generation debated the precise movements of troops at Gettysburg or the devastating march of General Sherman. We would sit on the porch steps, swatting away mosquitoes in the humid Georgia heat, completely enthralled by the romanticized tragedy of it all. Those veterans did not speak of the war as some distant historical event. They spoke of it as if it had happened only yesterday, their voices thick with lingering sorrow and unyielding defiance. I absorbed their cadences, their phrasing, and their unshakable belief in a bygone era. Even then, I was observing the stark contrast between the old world they mourned and the new, industrialized Atlanta that was rapidly expanding around us. My mother, Maybelle Stephens Mitchell, was a force of nature in her own right, a staunch suffragist who marched for women's right to vote and instilled in me a fierce independence that was quite unusual for a little Southern girl of my generation. She refused to let me be a delicate flower. When I was a child, my dress caught fire on an open grate, and after that, my mother put me in boys' trousers. I became a notorious tomboy, riding my pony, climbing trees and insisting that everyone call me Jimmy. I was a wild thing, constantly scraping my knees and getting into scrapes. But my imagination was always working. I began writing stories as soon as I could hold a pencil, filling cheap composition notebooks with tales of adventure, romance, and tragedy. I even wrote plays and forced the neighborhood children to act them out on our front porch. Education was paramount to my mother, and she constantly warned me that a woman must have something to fall back on, a way to support herself if the world turned upside down, just as it had for the women of her mother's generation. Once, she took me on a carriage ride past the ruined, crumbling chimneys of old plantation houses that still scarred the countryside, pointing to them as a grim warning of what happens when a society is entirely upended. She sent me to the Washington Seminary here in Atlanta, where I was perhaps more interested in socializing and writing for the school yearbook than I was in my formal studies, but I read voraciously. I devoured everything from Shakespeare to cheap dime novels. Eventually, my mother decided I should go north for a proper education, and I enrolled at Smith College in Massachusetts. I took to the independence of college life, but my time there was tragically cut short. In 1918, the great influenza pandemic swept across the globe, and it struck my mother. I rushed home to Atlanta, but I was too late. She had passed away before I could reach her. Her death shattered my world and ended my formal education, as I had to step into her shoes and take over the management of our household on Peachtree Street for my father and my brother. That profound loss and the sudden thrust into adult responsibilities marked the true end of my childhood, but the stories, the voices of those old veterans, and the indomitable spirit of the women I had grown up around were already permanently etched into my mind, waiting for the day I would finally put them to paper.